Imagine this. You're at work, doing your job, when your boss, someone who's been making sly, racially charged comments for weeks, suddenly demands you take a DNA test. Why? You ever meet someone so convinced of their own righteousness that they'd go to extreme lengths just to prove a point? Well, this is the story of one such man, a boss, filled with prejudice and so obsessed with proving his narrow-minded view of the world that he went too far. But in a twist no one saw coming, the tables turned, and he ended up discovering a truth about himself that shook him to his core. Let me take you into this moment, this unbelievable encounter between a boss and his employee. The boss, we'll call him Mr. Henderson, was the kind of person who always thought he was a step ahead, always thought he could read people with just a glance. But there was something more insidious beneath that surface, something that went beyond mere arrogance. He wasn't just opinionated, he was biased, plain and simple. Every comment, every look. He thought he could sum people up by their appearance, as if their skin tone or background told him everything he needed to know. But Mr. Henderson's prejudice ran deeper than mere words. He took pride in it, as if it was some kind of secret insight only he possessed. And there was one employee who stood at the center of his obsession. Let's call him David. Now, David was a hard-working individual, someone who always showed up, always delivered. But to Mr. Henderson, none of that mattered. In his eyes, David wasn't just an employee, he was a target. And for one reason only. Mr. Henderson was convinced David was mixed race, of some uncertain ethnic background that Mr. Henderson couldn't quite place, but was determined to figure out. And that's where things started to spiral. You see, for people like Mr. Henderson, racism isn't just an opinion. It's a need, a deep-seated urge to prove that their narrow view of the world is the correct one. And the more David succeeded at work, the more it ate at Mr. Henderson. The way David carried himself, the way he thrived despite the passive-aggressive comments, it all bothered the boss to no end. Every meeting, every interaction, it was there, the subtle digs, the suspicious looks. It was as if Mr. Henderson needed David's very existence to fit neatly into a box that he could label and control. Now, imagine the tension in that office. David, just trying to do his job, was constantly under scrutiny. Every task he completed, every achievement, overshadowed by a lingering cloud of judgment. It was like being on trial every single day, except the judge had already made up his mind, and no evidence would ever be good enough. And then came the final straw. One day, seemingly out of nowhere, Mr. Henderson summoned David to his office. But this wasn't about work. Oh no, it was about something far more personal. With a smug expression plastered on his face, Mr. Henderson made a demand that would change everything: a DNA test. Can you imagine that? A DNA test. Who even thinks of doing that in a professional environment? But to Mr. Henderson, this was his ultimate weapon, his way of proving once and for all that his suspicions about David's heritage were correct. He wanted to prove it. Prove that David was mixed race. Prove that his instincts were right, and somehow, in his twisted mind, justify all the disrespect and microaggressions he'd subjected David to over the years. The audacity was almost beyond comprehension. And what's worse, Mr. Henderson genuinely believed David had no choice but to comply. But here's the thing. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was about control. This was about making David feel small, about reducing his identity to something Mr. Henderson could manipulate. Race was being used as a weapon in a power struggle that had nothing to do with performance or professionalism. But, as you'll soon find out, the results of that DNA test, well, they didn't unfold the way Mr. Henderson had expected. In fact, the truth that was uncovered would leave him stunned, speechless, and facing a reality he never saw coming. Stick with me, because this story is about to take a turn that not even he could have predicted. At first, David didn't pay much attention to Mr. Henderson's stares or offhand comments. He was used to it. People like Mr. Henderson, they were a dime a dozen. In fact, David had worked for bosses like him before, men who hid their biases behind a smile, a handshake, or worse, polite professionalism. So, when Mr. Henderson started making little comments here and there, David let them roll off his back. After all, what was he supposed to do? Call out his boss every time the man let his prejudices slip through? It wasn't worth the fight, or so David thought. But here's the thing about people like Mr. Henderson. They're never satisfied with just thinking they're right. They need everyone else to know it too. And as the days turned into weeks, Mr. Henderson's fascination with David grew. It wasn't just about race anymore. It was about control. He couldn't stand the idea that David might be something other than what he'd assumed. And so, the subtle remarks started turning into something more sinister. "David, where's your family from originally?" Mr. Henderson would ask casually during a meeting. His eyes narrowed just enough to let David know the question wasn't innocent. Or, you've got a look about you. Ever looked into your family tree? It was as if every word, every look was meant to chip away at David's sense of identity, to make him feel smaller, like he didn't belong. David, though, wasn't about to play into the boss's game. He kept his head down, kept doing his job, and tried his best to ignore the growing tension. But that's easier said than done when you're being watched like a hawk, every move scrutinized. Mr. Henderson wasn't just asking questions. Anymore, he was obsessed. He began to hint at David's supposed background in front of other employees, making little comments that hung in the air just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. And the worst part, no one said anything. David's co-workers saw what was happening, but silence ruled the office. It was the kind of situation where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one wants to be the one to rock the boat. They had families, jobs, reputations to protect. Who would stand up to the boss over something as small as casual racism? But to David, it wasn't small at all. Day by day, comment by comment, Mr. Henderson was chipping away at him, undermining not just his work, but his very sense of self. What do you do when the person who's supposed to lead you, supposed to create a safe work environment, is the very one tearing you down? And yet, despite all this, David kept his cool. Every time Mr. Henderson tried to push him, David just stood firm, refusing to give the man what he wanted. Mr. Henderson wanted a reaction. He wanted David to break, to lose his composure, to prove that he was different. But David wouldn't give him the satisfaction. This made Mr. Henderson even more desperate. His curiosity had turned into an obsession that quickly became the only thing he could think about. It wasn't enough to just speculate about David's background anymore. He needed proof. He needed to know, to confirm what he had convinced himself was the truth. And that's when the real trouble started. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson called David into his office. It was a Friday, the end of a long week, and David was looking forward to the weekend. But as soon as he stepped into the boss's office, he knew something was off. The atmosphere was tense. The blinds were half-drawn, casting strange shadows across the room. Mr. Henderson didn't even bother with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "I've been thinking a lot about your heritage, David," he began, his voice dripping with fake curiosity. "You ever done one of those DNA tests? The ones that tell you your ancestry?" David blinked. Was this really happening? "I've done one myself," Mr. Henderson continued, leaning back in his chair as if he was about to share some deep personal story. "Turns out I'm 100% European, not a drop of anything else in me. You ever thought about doing one, just to see where you come from?" David stood there, unsure of how to respond. Was this some kind of joke? A trap? But Mr. Henderson's expression made it clear that he wasn't kidding. He was dead serious. "I'd be happy to pay for it," Mr. Henderson added, smiling in a way that made David's skin crawl. "I think it'd be enlightening." And that's when David realized what was happening. Mr. Henderson wasn't just making a suggestion. This was a command, dressed up as a favor. He was demanding a DNA test, not out of curiosity, but out of a sick need to prove something. To prove that David wasn't what he seemed, that he was different, that he fit the stereotype Mr. Henderson had in his mind. For a moment, David considered walking out. He could have quit right then and there, and maybe he should have. But there was something in the way Mr. Henderson was looking at him, that smug satisfaction, that made David pause. He wanted to see how far the man was willing to go with this. "You want me to take a DNA test?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. "Think of it as a learning experience," Mr. Henderson said with a shrug. "For both of us." David's mind was racing. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. He'd heard of racist bosses before, sure, but this was on a whole new level. And yet, David found himself nodding. "All right," he said quietly, "if that's what you want." And with that, the wheels were set in motion. Little did Mr. Henderson know, the results of that DNA test were about to turn his world upside down. The moment David agreed to the DNA test, a chill settled in the office. It wasn't spoken out loud, but everyone felt it. There was this strange tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The test itself? Well, it was just a matter of logistics now. A few clicks online, a swab in a tube, and then the waiting game began. Mr. Henderson, of course, could hardly contain his excitement. He walked around the office like a man on a mission, convinced that the results would soon confirm everything he had been thinking about David. The smugness was palpable. He made little remarks in passing, dropping hints about what was to come, as if he was some kind of oracle about to unveil a grand truth. It was sickening. For David, the test wasn't just about his ancestry. It wasn't about where his family came from. This was something else, something far more personal. It was about being forced into a corner, about having his identity put under a microscope, as if his value as a person could be reduced to percentages on a report. And for what? Just to satisfy his boss's warped sense of superiority? The days dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. And while Mr. Henderson was busy gloating about the test, David was left with a growing sense of dread. What would the results say? Not that it mattered, of course. It shouldn't have mattered. But in that office, under the weight of Mr. Henderson's judgmental gaze, it felt like everything hinged on that report. David found himself thinking about it more and more. What if the results weren't what Mr. Henderson expected? Would it change anything? Or would the boss just find another way to belittle him? In the background, the office staff carried on as if nothing was happening. But everyone knew. Conversations felt a little stilted. And when Mr. Henderson walked into a room, there was a subtle shift. People whispered in the break room, glanced sideways at David with a mix of pity and curiosity. They didn't say anything outright, but the silence was deafening. No one wanted to get involved. And then one morning, the email came through. David's heart skipped a beat when he saw the notification pop up on his phone. The subject line was simple enough. "Your DNA results are ready." He stared at it for a moment, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and resignation. He knew this was coming, but now that the moment had arrived, he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Mr. Henderson, on the other hand, couldn't wait. He practically burst into David's office, eyes wide with excitement. "Did you get it?" he asked, not bothering to hide his eagerness. He was like a kid waiting for a Christmas present, completely oblivious to the emotional weight this carried for David. David nodded, still staring at his phone. He hadn't opened the email yet. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Mr. Henderson pressed, his voice oozing with anticipation. "Let's see what it says." David took a deep breath and opened the email. He scanned the first few lines, his eyes moving quickly over the percentages, the breakdowns. There it was, his ancestry laid out in cold, clinical detail. Part African, part European, part Native American, a mix of cultures and histories, each with its own story, its own weight. It was a complex, beautiful tapestry, but all Mr. Henderson cared about was the confirmation of his suspicions. Mr. Henderson leaned in, his eyes gleaming as he scanned the report over David's shoulder. His grin widened as he spotted the percentage that proved what he had been waiting for. There it was. David was mixed. Mr. Henderson didn't say anything at first, but the look on his face said it all. Victory. He had won. Or so he thought. But then, something happened. David, already feeling the sting of humiliation, noticed something strange in the email. Another section, Another set of percentages, but this time it wasn't his. "Wait," David muttered, scrolling down further. "There's something else here." Mr. Henderson frowned, his confidence flickering for just a moment. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little less certain now. David's eyes narrowed as he read the new information. "It says here there's a match. Another family member in the system." He paused, glancing up at Mr. Henderson. "A close relative." Mr. Henderson's smug expression faltered. "What? That can't be right. Are you sure you're reading it correctly?" David's heart was racing now. The match wasn't just some distant cousin. According to the report, this was someone closely related to him. And the more David looked at the details, the more he realized the truth. "Mr. Henderson," David said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief. "It says here we're related." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Mr. Henderson's face went pale as the reality of what David had just said sank in. He blinked, as if trying to process the words. That's impossible," he stammered. "There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. The report was clear. Somehow, someway, Mr. Henderson, the man who had spent weeks trying to prove David's otherness, was family. They shared ancestry, and not just any ancestry. It turned out that Mr. Henderson wasn't as 100% European as he thought. His DNA revealed traces of African heritage, a fact that shattered everything he believed about himself. David stared at the screen, a mix of emotions swirling inside him: disbelief, shock, even a little satisfaction. But more than anything, there was a sense of irony so thick it was almost laughable. Mr. Henderson, meanwhile, stood frozen. His entire worldview had just collapsed in front of him. The very test he had demanded to prove David's heritage had turned on him, revealing a truth he wasn't prepared to face. And in that moment, everything changed. Underscore, 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 underscore. For what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Henderson just stood there, frozen. His usually smug, confident demeanor had been replaced by something foreign: confusion, disbelief, even fear. The man who had spent weeks lording over David, making assumptions, questioning his identity, was now facing a reality he never could have imagined. He, the one who had prided himself on his pure European ancestry, was mixed. And not just mixed, but with African roots. The irony was so thick you could almost taste it. The silence in the room was deafening, and it was David who finally broke it, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "So, what now?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "Still think you know everything about people just by looking at them?" Mr. Henderson blinked, like a man waking from a bad dream. This doesn't make any sense," he muttered under his breath. He began to pace the office, running a hand through his hair as if trying to shake off the truth that had just slapped him in the face. There must be a mistake. DNA tests, they aren't always accurate, right? David crossed his arms, watching the man unravel before him. It was almost poetic, really. After weeks of enduring Mr. Henderson's arrogance, watching him squirm like this felt satisfying. But there was more to this than just satisfaction. David felt something deeper. Pity, maybe? Empathy? It was strange. But there was a part of him that saw Mr. Henderson not as the boss who had tormented him, but as a man who had just had his entire world flipped upside down. Mr. Henderson's pacing grew more frantic. "There has to be an explanation," he said, more to himself than to David. My family, we've always been European. There's no way." He trailed off, staring blankly at the floor, as if the answers would magically appear there. David could see the cracks forming in Mr. Henderson's carefully constructed identity. It was more than just a DNA result. This was the unraveling of a lifetime of beliefs, of prejudices that had been passed down, reinforced, and lived by. Mr. Henderson wasn't just facing the fact that he was wrong about David. He was facing the fact that he was wrong about himself. "You know," David said, his voice calm but firm, "you spent so much time trying to prove that I was different. But the truth is, we're not that different at all. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Mr. Henderson looked up, meeting David's eyes. There was something there, something raw and vulnerable that hadn't been there before. It was like he was seeing David for the first time, not as an employee or someone to be judged, but as a person, equal in complexity and humanity. But the moment didn't last long. Mr. Henderson shook his head, retreating back into his shell of denial. "This can't be right," he muttered again, gripping the edge of his desk as if holding on for dear life. "I need to speak to someone. I need a second opinion." David shook his head slowly, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're looking for answers in the wrong place, Mr. Henderson." Mr. Henderson glared at him, but there was no venom behind it, just desperation. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. "You think this is some kind of joke?" David's expression softened. "No, I don't," he replied quietly. "But maybe you're starting to see how I felt all these weeks. Being judged, being forced into a box that doesn't fit. It's not a joke, Mr. Henderson. It's just life." Mr. Henderson slumped into his chair, his bravado completely drained. He looked down at the DNA results on the screen, his hand trembling as he scrolled through the report again, as if hoping something would change. But the facts were there, staring back at him, unmovable. He was mixed. The percentages didn't lie. For the first time in his life, Mr. Henderson was being confronted with the reality of his own identity, and he didn't know how to handle it. He had spent so much time building up his sense of superiority, his belief that he was part of some pure lineage, and now, all of that was crumbling. "How is this even possible?" he whispered, more to himself than to David. "My parents, my grandparents, none of them ever mentioned." David watched him closely, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He had every right to be angry, to lash out, to rub this in Mr. Henderson's face. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. Or maybe it was the look of utter helplessness on Mr. Henderson's face. The man was lost, drowning in a sea of confusion and fear. "You know," David began, his voice soft but steady, "it doesn't change who you are. The DNA, it's just part of the picture. It doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do with this knowledge." Mr. Henderson looked up at him, his eyes hollow, searching for some kind of reassurance. "I've been so wrong, haven't I?" David nodded, not out of malice, but out of understanding. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You have. But now you know, and what you do next is what really matters." There was a long silence between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had just been uncovered. Mr. Henderson, the man who had always been so sure of himself, now sat at his desk like a child lost in a maze. And David, the man who had endured so much under his boss's scrutiny, now stood before him not as a victim, but as someone offering a path forward. "You've got a choice," David continued, stepping forward. "You can keep fighting this, keep denying it, or you can accept it, learn from it, and maybe, just maybe, start seeing the world a little differently." Mr. Henderson swallowed hard, his eyes flicking back to the DNA report on the screen. He was still grappling with it, still trying to make sense of the new reality he had been thrust into. But deep down, he knew David was right. I don't know if I can," Mr. Henderson muttered, his voice small, fragile. David shrugged. "Maybe you can't, but maybe you'll surprise yourself." And with that, David turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Henderson alone with the truth he had so desperately tried to avoid. The truth that had been staring him in the face the whole time. That identity is more than skin deep, more than bloodlines or percentages. It's about the choices we make and the person we choose to be when faced with the unexpected. When David left the office, Mr. Henderson remained at his desk, staring at the DNA report. His mind was racing, but he felt paralyzed. The world around him seemed to blur as he focused on the cold, clinical words on the screen. Mixed, African ancestry, words he never imagined would apply to him. At first, there was disbelief. He scrolled through the report again and again, hoping he'd missed something, that maybe it was a mistake, some glitch in the system. But there it was, every time he looked. Undeniable proof that the man who had spent his entire life looking down on others for their differences was, in fact, no different himself. His hands trembled as he clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger bubbling up inside him. How could this be? How could he? The proud descendant of what he always believed was a pure European lineage, have African ancestry. It was impossible. No one in his family had ever mentioned anything like this. They were all proud white European. At least, that's what they told him. He felt the walls closing in on him, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. His whole life had been built around this idea, that he was superior, better than others because of his heritage. He had used that belief to justify every racist comment, every dismissive glance, every assumption he had ever made about someone's worth based on their appearance. And now he was being told that he was part of the very group he had spent his life looking down on. It was too much to bear. Anger turned to denial. He pushed away from his desk, pacing the office like a caged animal. There had to be another explanation. Maybe the test was wrong. Maybe the company made a mistake. After all, DNA tests weren't foolproof, right? He had heard stories about people getting the wrong results, hadn't he? That's it, he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. There's been a mistake. He grabbed his phone and dialed the DNA testing company's customer service line. His heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang. When a representative finally answered, Mr. Henderson's words came out in a rush. "I need to speak to someone about my DNA results," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I think there's been a mistake. The results I got, they're wrong." The representative on the other end of the line was calm, professional. They explained the accuracy of the tests, the cross-checking procedures, the slim margin for error, but none of it registered with Mr. Henderson. He wasn't listening. He couldn't accept what he was hearing. "So, you're telling me it's correct?" he asked, his voice rising. "There's no way it could be wrong." The representative apologized and confirmed that the results were accurate. Mr. Henderson slammed the phone down, his hands shaking. He felt a white-hot rage rising in his chest, but it wasn't just directed at the test or the company. It was directed at himself. Deep down, in the part of his mind he had tried to ignore, he knew the truth. The results weren't wrong. This was real. He collapsed into his chair, staring at his reflection in the darkened window of his office. Who was he now? What did this make him? Everything he thought he knew about himself had been ripped away in an instant. His family had always told him they were pure European, proud of their heritage. Had they been lying? Or was this some hidden part of their history that no one had ever spoken about? He thought back to the things he had said over the years. The jokes, the slurs, the assumptions he had made about people based on the color of their skin. He felt sick. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his beliefs. But now he wasn't sure of anything. His thoughts turned to David, the way he had treated him, the way he had used race as a weapon against him, all the while believing he was somehow better. But the truth was, they were more alike than he could have ever imagined. Mr. Henderson's chest tightened as guilt washed over him. He thought about the looks on his other employees' faces when he had made those offhand comments about David's heritage. He remembered the silence in the room when he had pushed David to take the DNA test, as if the power dynamic made it acceptable. But now he realized how small, how petty, and how hateful he had been. He couldn't escape the shame that was closing in on him. The test hadn't just revealed his ancestry. It had revealed him, the real him, the man hiding behind layers of prejudice and arrogance. He had spent his life living a lie, and now it was all coming apart. For a moment, he considered walking out of the office, leaving everything behind, his reputation, his career, his entire life. It felt like it was crumbling before his eyes. But then something strange happened. Amidst the chaos of his emotions, a thought emerged, a thought that terrified him, but also intrigued him. What if this was an opportunity? What if this was his chance to change? He had spent his life believing in a certain version of the world, one where people were defined by their race, where some were better than others based on where they came from. But now, faced with the undeniable truth about himself, he realized how hollow that belief was. What if he could let go of it? What if he could learn from this, grow from this? The idea scared him. Change was terrifying. Admitting he was wrong was terrifying. But for the first time, he could see that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. But could he take it? Mr. Henderson looked at the DNA results again, his reflection staring back at him from the screen. This wasn't just about race. This was about identity, about confronting the person he had become and deciding if he wanted to stay that way. He thought about David again. David had every right to be angry, every right to hate him for what he had done. But he hadn't. In fact, David had offered him something unexpected, a way forward, a chance to change. It was humbling, to say the least. Could he do it? Could he become someone different? Someone better? The doubts lingered, but there was a part of him that wanted to try. He didn't know where to start or how to undo the damage he had caused, but he knew that staying the same was no longer an option. He couldn't go back to being the man he had been before. Not after this. With a deep breath, Mr. Henderson closed the DNA report and stood up. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he knew he had to take it. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Not just to his employees, not just to David, but to himself. Change wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But it had to start somewhere, and it had to start now. As David walked out of Mr. Henderson's office, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It was a calm he hadn't expected. He had imagined this moment for weeks. How it might feel to finally put Mr. Henderson in his place, to watch the arrogant man crumble under the weight of his own ignorance. But now that it had happened, it didn't feel like a victory. Instead, it felt like something else, something unfinished. David had endured weeks of Mr. Henderson's subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism. The pointed comments about his background, the relentless need to question his identity. It had all been exhausting. And yet, when the DNA test results had come in, revealing the irony of it all, David hadn't felt the satisfaction he thought he would. He had expected a moment of triumph, but what he got was something far more complicated. As he walked down the hallway, he replayed the moment in his mind. The look on Mr. Henderson's face, stunned, disbelieving, and even afraid. It was a look David had seen before, but never on someone like Mr. Henderson. That look, the one that said, "I've been wrong this whole time," had always been reserved for people on the other side of the power dynamic. But today, the tables had turned. David stopped by the break room, leaning against the wall as he let out a long breath. He knew his co-workers were curious. They had been watching this whole saga unfold from the sidelines, pretending not to notice when Mr. Henderson made his offhand remarks, when he pushed David toward that DNA test like it was some kind of ultimatum. They hadn't said anything, but David had seen the looks, the whispered conversations. They knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to get involved. He understood why. It wasn't easy to stand up to someone like Mr. Henderson, especially when he held the power. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow. David had felt isolated in those moments, like he was the only one who saw through the facade. And now that the truth had come out, now that Mr. Henderson had been exposed, David wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him wanted to be angry at the weeks of tension, the humiliation of having his identity questioned by a man who didn't even know his own. But another part of him, a quieter part, felt something closer to pity. Because what Mr. Henderson had experienced in that office, learning that he wasn't who he thought he was, realizing that his whole worldview had been built on a lie, that was something David had seen in others before. It was the look of someone realizing, for the first time, that the world wasn't as simple as they had believed. David knew what it felt like to have people look at him and make assumptions. He had spent his whole life dealing with it. From the time he was a kid, growing up in a neighborhood where people constantly asked, "What are you?" as if he were some kind of puzzle to be solved. He had learned early on that people didn't like uncertainty. They liked to put you in a box, to know exactly where you fit. And when they couldn't, that's when the discomfort set in. That's what had happened to Mr. Henderson. The man had spent his life categorizing people, drawing lines between us and them. But now, with the DNA results staring him in the face, those lines had blurred. Mr. Henderson had become the very thing he had feared, and David couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. But pity wasn't enough. It didn't erase the weeks of tension, the feeling of being cornered by a man who had used his power to make David feel small. It didn't erase the hurt of being treated like an outsider, even when David had done nothing but his job, and done it well. Pity wasn't going to change what had happened. What David wanted, what he needed, was accountability. He didn't want Mr. Henderson to apologize out of obligation or guilt. He didn't want a hollow, "I'm sorry," just to smooth things over. What David wanted was for Mr. Henderson to understand. To truly understand the damage his words, his assumptions, his entire attitude had caused. Because this wasn't just about a DNA test. It was about the way people like Mr. Henderson wielded their power, using race as a weapon, as a way to control and belittle those they deemed other. David's thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the lessons his parents had taught him. They had always told him to be proud of who he was, to never let anyone make him feel less than. But they had also taught him something else: compassion, the ability to see beyond someone's ignorance, to recognize that hate was often born out of fear. And fear? Fear could be overcome, but only if the person was willing to face it. David wasn't sure if Mr. Henderson was capable of that. People didn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something. Maybe this revelation would crack open that hardened shell of arrogance, that sense of superiority Mr. Henderson had carried for so long. And if it didn't, well, David had done his part. He had stood his ground. He hadn't let Mr. Henderson's assumptions define him. As David pushed himself off the wall and headed back to his desk, he felt lighter. Not because the situation was resolved. Far from it. But because he knew that, in the end, Mr. Henderson's ignorance wasn't his burden to carry. The DNA results, the truth they revealed, were only the beginning of Mr. Henderson's journey. Whether or not he chose to change was up to him. David had faced the storm and come out the other side, stronger, clearer, and with a deeper understanding of himself. And now, it was up to Mr. Henderson to decide if he would do the same. The next morning, the office buzzed with a quiet tension. Word had spread about the DNA results, though no one said it outright. People whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting toward Mr. Henderson's office every time he walked by. It wasn't just David who felt the weight of the situation anymore. Everyone did. Mr. Henderson had barely slept the night before. His mind had raced with a million thoughts, none of which brought him peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the DNA results flashing across his mind like a neon sign: mixed African ancestry. He had always thought of himself as a strong man, a man of certainty, but now he wasn't sure of anything. When he arrived at the office, he felt the stares, the shift in the atmosphere. People knew, maybe not all the details, but enough to make things uncomfortable. He tried to go about his day as usual, but everything felt off-kilter. His once rock-solid identity had been shattered, and the looks he received from his employees only made it worse. But it wasn't until David walked into his office that the real confrontation began. David stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression calm but firm. He wasn't here for revenge or to gloat. He was here for answers, for closure, maybe even a little accountability. "Got a minute?" David asked, his voice steady. Mr. Henderson nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah, come in." David walked in and closed the door behind him, the silence in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure of how to start. He had spent his entire career as the boss, the one in control, but today, he felt small, exposed. David didn't waste any time. "I think we need to talk about what happened," he said, his voice low but direct. Mr. Henderson nodded again, though he wasn't sure what to say. Apologize? Defend himself? Admit he had been wrong? The words felt tangled in his throat, and he didn't know which ones to pull out first. David didn't give him much time to think. "You put me through weeks of hell," he said bluntly, questioning my identity, pushing me to take that test like it was some kind of game. And now you're the one who's got to face the truth. Mr. Henderson winced at the harshness of David's words, but he didn't interrupt. He knew David had every right to be angry. He deserved to let it all out. "I'm not here to make you feel bad, Mr. Henderson," David continued, his tone softening just a bit. "I'm not even here to make you apologize, though you probably should. I'm here because we can't keep pretending like this didn't happen." Mr. Henderson took a deep breath, his chest tight. He hadn't prepared for this conversation, not really. He had run through a dozen different scenarios in his head, but none of them felt right. Now, sitting here in front of David, he realized there was no perfect way to handle this. He just had to face it head on. "You're right," Mr. Henderson said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I put you in an impossible position. I was wrong." David watched him closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you do it? What made you think you had the right to question me like that?" Mr. Henderson struggled to find the words. How could he explain years of ingrained bias? How could he admit that he had been so blinded by his own assumptions that he never stopped to consider the damage he was causing? I don't know," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I thought I knew everything. I thought I could tell what people were like just by looking at them. I've been doing it for years, and no one ever questioned me." David leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Well, I'm questioning you now." Mr. Henderson felt the sting of those words, but he didn't argue. How could he? Everything David was saying was true. He had been arrogant, small-minded, and cruel. He had allowed his prejudice to cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. "I get it," David said, leaning back in his chair. "You grew up in a world where race was everything, where people like me were always seen as other. But that doesn't excuse what you did. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like my heritage was something to be ashamed of." Mr. Henderson's eyes filled with shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words hanging in the air like a fragile thread. David didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch out, letting Mr. Henderson sit in his discomfort. Apologies were easy. Change wasn't. "I don't want your apology," David said finally, his voice firm but calm. "What I want is for you to understand. I want you to realize that what you did wasn't just about me. It was about how you see the world. And until that changes, nothing else will." Mr. Henderson nodded, feeling the weight of David's words sink in. He had spent so much time believing that race defined everything, that it was a lens through which he could understand the world. But now, he realized how narrow that view had been. "I do understand," Mr. Henderson said quietly. "I know I have a lot to learn, a lot to change." David watched him for a moment, his expression softening just a little. "That's a start," he said. "But it's just a start." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the tension slowly ebbing away. It wasn't exactly forgiveness, but it was something, an acknowledgement, maybe, that change was possible. "You've got a lot of work to do," David said as he stood up. "And not just with me, with everyone in this office. You can't keep leading people like you did before. That has to change." Mr. Henderson nodded again, feeling the weight of David's words settle in. He knew David was right. This wasn't just about the DNA test or their relationship. It was about how he treated everyone, how he led, how he saw the world. "I'll do better," Mr. Henderson said quietly, his voice filled with a new sense of resolve. David didn't smile or offer any words of encouragement. He simply nodded, as if to say, "We'll see." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Henderson alone with his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Henderson felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Hope. Not because things were fixed, they weren't, but because now, for the first time, he saw the cracks in the foundation of the life he had built. And maybe, just maybe, those cracks were the first step toward building something better. As Mr. Henderson sat alone in his office, the weight of everything that had transpired finally began to settle. The truth wasn't just in the DNA test. It was in the cracks that had formed in his identity, the harsh reality that everything he thought he knew about himself had been built on shaky ground. And now, with those cracks wide open, he had a choice to make. He had always believed in categories. People were either this or that. You could tell by the way they looked, the way they spoke, where they came from. It made life simple, clean, organized. But now, things weren't so simple. The lines he had spent his life drawing, between races, between people, had blurred, and for the first time, Mr. Henderson found himself on the other side of those lines. It wasn't just about the fact that he was mixed. That was shocking, yes, but it went deeper than that. It was about everything he had done, every choice he had made based on that faulty understanding of identity. He had hurt people, David most of all, because he had been so sure that race defined everything. And now he was left with the uncomfortable truth. It didn't. He wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge yet. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, especially not when you'd spent a lifetime living a certain way. But David had been right. It was a start towards seeing the world and the people in it differently. Mr. Henderson thought about David's words. It wasn't just about me. It's about how you see the world. It was a hard pill to swallow, knowing that his actions had caused real pain. But at the same time, it opened his eyes to something he had refused to acknowledge for years. That maybe, just maybe, the way he had been living wasn't right. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel ashamed to admit it. David, on the other hand, had his own reflections. As he sat at his desk, he thought about everything that had happened. The irony of it all still hung in the air. Mr. Henderson, of all people, having African ancestry, the same man who had looked down on him, judged him, and used race as a weapon had been forced to confront his own heritage. It felt surreal, like some strange cosmic joke. But beyond the irony was something more serious, something deeper. David had spent his whole life dealing with people like Mr. Henderson. People who thought they knew everything based on the color of your skin. People who made assumptions about who you were before they even knew your name. And for the most part, David had learned to rise above it. He knew who he was, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. But this had been different. Mr. Henderson hadn't just made assumptions. He had forced David to question his own identity, to prove something that didn't need proving. And for what? To satisfy some twisted need for control? It had been exhausting, and it had taken everything David had not to let it break him. But now that the truth was out, David didn't feel broken. He felt stronger, not because he had won in any real sense. This wasn't a game, after all, but because he had faced something difficult and come out the other side with his dignity intact. And that was worth more than any test result. As he thought about what came next, David knew it wasn't just about him and Mr. Henderson anymore. This was about more than a DNA test, more than a workplace dispute. This was about confronting the deep-seated prejudices that existed in every corner of society, the ones that told people they were better or worse based on nothing more than the color of their skin. David had always known that change was slow, but he also knew that it had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start for Mr. Henderson. The man had a long way to go, but David had seen something in him that day, a glimmer of realization, of accountability. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the days that followed, the tension in the office began to ease. Mr. Henderson didn't make a grand apology or call a meeting to explain what had happened. That wasn't his style. But there were small changes, subtle shifts in the way he interacted with people. He listened more. He didn't make the offhand comments that used to pepper every conversation. He was quieter, more reflective. David noticed the change, and while he didn't say anything, he appreciated it. He knew it wasn't enough to undo what had happened, but it was a start. Mr. Henderson had a lot to learn, a lot to unlearn, and David wasn't naive enough to think that one revelation would erase a lifetime of prejudice. But it was a step in the right direction. For those watching this video, this isn't just a story about a racist boss and a DNA test. It's a story about identity, about how we see ourselves and others, and about the power of realizing that maybe, just maybe, we've been wrong. It's about the fact that we're more alike than we are different, even when we don't want to admit it. And this story isn't just about Mr. Henderson and David. It's about all of us. How many times have we made assumptions about someone based on the way they look? How often have we let those assumptions guide how we treat people, even if we don't realize it? The truth is, we're all guilty of it at some point. But the real question is, are we willing to change? If this story has made you think, if it's made you question some of the things you've always believed, then that's a good thing. It means you're on the right path, the path towards seeing the world and the people in it a little more clearly. But the work doesn't stop here. Change takes time, and it takes effort. It takes listening to the people around you, understanding their experiences, and recognizing that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. So, if this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently, don't keep it to yourself. Take a moment to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because stories like this one aren't just entertainment. They're a chance for all of us to grow. Let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about how we can all start seeing the world a little differently, one story at a time.